320 men died in 18 seconds, not in combat, not behind enemy lines, on American soil, at a Navy base 40 miles from San Francisco. And when the men who survived refused to walk back into the same conditions that had just killed their friends, the United States Navy called it mutiny. That is where this story begins. And by the time it ends, you will understand why the Port Chicago disaster was not an accident waiting to happen. It was a system working exactly as it was designed to. And the men who paid for it were the ones who had never been given a choice. In the summer of 1944, the United States was fighting on two fronts. Ammunition was the lifeblood of both wars. Ships needed to be loaded. Shells, bombs, depth charges, and incendiary devices needed to move from depot to dock to ocean as fast as humanly possible. Port Chicago Naval Magazine, on the banks of the Sacramento River in California, was one of the primary loading stations on the West Coast. Thousands of tons of live ordnance passed through its docks every month. The men doing that work were almost exclusively black enlisted sailors, not by accident, by policy. The United States Navy in 1944 was a segregated institution. Black sailors were barred from combat roles. They were barred from most technical positions. They were assigned to the labor divisions, the ammunition divisions, where the work was unrelenting, physically brutal, and almost certainly fatal if something went wrong. And something was always close to going wrong. The loading conditions at Port Chicago were, by any reasonable standard, dangerous beyond measure. Enlisted men, most of them teenagers, most of them with no formal training in ammunition handling, were ordered to move live ordnance by hand, by winch, by improvised method, in the dark, under pressure, in competition. The officers ran loading contests between divisions. They kept score. They pushed their men to move faster than the last shift. They placed informal wagers on whose crew could load the most tonnage in a single night. The men being pushed were working with armed bombs. Nobody had told most of them how to defuse one. Complaints were raised. They were ignored. Black sailors who expressed concern about safety were told their only alternative was a court-martial. The system was clear. Load the ships. Move the ordnance. Do not ask questions. You are enlisted men. You are here to work. On the evening of July 17, 1944, two cargo ships were docked at Port Chicago, the E.A. Bryan and the Quinoa Victory. The E.A. Bryan was already loaded with nearly 5,000 tons of ammunition, bombs, depth charges, fragmentation clusters. The Quinoa Victory was being loaded by Division 3. The night shift was working. The music from the enlisted barracks carried faintly over the water, and then, at 10:18 in the evening, the pier vanished. Two explosions. The first triggered the second within a fraction of a second. The combined detonation was equivalent to a small nuclear event. It registered on seismographs as far away as Nevada. The E.A. Bryan was vaporized, not damaged, not sunk, vaporized. Pieces of the ship were found miles away. The Quinoa Victory was thrown into the air and torn apart. Every man on the pier, every man on the loading crew was killed instantly. 320 men dead. 18 seconds. The explosion blew out windows in towns across the county. It was seen and heard from San Francisco. Sailors in the barracks were knocked from their bunks. When the survivors ran toward the dock, there was no dock. There was fire on the water. There was wreckage. There were no bodies intact enough to recover. Of the 320 men killed that night, 202 were black enlisted sailors assigned to the ammunition divisions. 15 were their white officers. The rest were Naval Armed Guard members and merchant sailors aboard the ships. The Navy's immediate response was not an investigation into how this had happened. It was a press blackout. The explosion at Port Chicago was the deadliest domestic military disaster of the Second World War, and the American public was told almost nothing. No press conferences, no full accounting. The story was buried under wartime censorship and the Navy's determination to control its own narrative. For the surviving sailors, there was 1 week of leave. Then orders: return to the docks, resume loading. On August 9, 1944, 23 days after 320 of their fellow sailors had been killed loading the same type of ordnance at the same type of dock, the men of Port Chicago were marched back to the pier. 258 of them refused to board. They did not riot. They did not threaten anyone. They stood, or they sat, or they simply did not move. They said they were afraid. They said the conditions had not changed. They said they did not believe it was safe. Several men said they would accept any punishment except being ordered to load live ammunition without training, without safety measures, and without any accounting for how the last loading crew had died. The Navy's response was immediate and severe. All 258 men were charged with disobeying orders. Most were threatened with the possibility of execution under wartime naval law. Under that pressure, all but 50 signed statements agreeing to return to work. The 50 who held their position were formally charged with mutiny. Mutiny. a charge that carried the death penalty in wartime. The court-martial began in October 1944. All 50 defendants were black. Every officer on the court-martial panel was white. The defense called witnesses who testified to the unsafe conditions, the loading competitions, the lack of training, the pressure placed on enlisted men to move faster with live ordnance. None of it was disputed on the facts. The prosecution's argument was simpler. The men had refused a direct order. In wartime, that was mutiny. The context did not matter. Their fear did not matter. Thurgood Marshall attended the trial as an observer for the NAACP. He wrote afterward that the proceeding was a miscarriage of justice so complete it was difficult to describe in legal terms. He noted that the same Navy that could not explain how 320 men died in 18 seconds had found time to court-martial 50 of the survivors for being afraid to go back. He noted that not one of the white officers who ran the loading competitions, who pushed the men beyond safe practice, who had direct command responsibility for the conditions on that pier, faced a single charge. Not a formal inquiry, not a demotion, not a reprimand entered into the record. All 50 men were convicted of mutiny. Sentences ranged from 8 to 15 years of hard labor with dishonorable discharges. The verdict was reviewed by Admiral Carleton Wright, who upheld all 50 convictions. It was reviewed further up the chain and upheld again. The Navy was satisfied. 50 black sailors had defied an order. They had been punished. The matter was resolved. It was not resolved. Thurgood Marshall's published report on the trial generated national attention. The NAACP mounted a sustained pressure campaign. Politicians wrote letters. Questions were asked that the Navy could not answer cleanly. By 1945, the sentences were being quietly reduced. By 1946, the remaining convicted men were released. No conviction was ever officially overturned. No one received a formal exoneration from the United States Navy. The dishonorable discharges remained on record, denying the men veterans' benefits they had earned. The Navy's own investigation into the cause of the explosion concluded that it was likely the result of improper ammunition handling, the very conditions the sailors had been trying to describe for months before the disaster. The investigation named no individual responsible. It recommended improved safety procedures. The officers in command at Port Chicago were reassigned. Some were promoted. Decades passed. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the explosion, the Navy held a commemoration. President Clinton later acknowledged the injustice done to the Port Chicago sailors. In 1999, Congress passed a resolution recognizing the men's service. There has never been a full presidential pardon. There has never been a formal military exoneration of the 50 convicted sailors as a group. The convictions remain part of the official record, sitting quietly in the archive where most people will never find them. The men who refused to go back to that pier were not agitators. They were not troublemakers. They were sailors who had just watched their friends disappear in a fireball caused by the very conditions they were being ordered to return to. They were men who understood, with clarity no training manual could have provided, exactly how close the edge was. They asked for safety. They were given a court-martial. 320 men died in 18 seconds at Port Chicago. The Navy buried the story, punished the survivors, promoted the officers, and called it order. That is not an accident of history. That is history doing exactly what it was built to do. And 50 men who refused to disappear quietly into it paid the price for knowing the difference.